Hi everyone, and welcome to This Is The Way, the channel where we discuss all things concerning Him who is the way, the truth, and the life. Today's video has been long anticipated. I have been wanting to discuss some things that have been said by this particular person that we're discussing today, Wesley Huff. I've been wanting to respond to some of the things that he's put out online, especially about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or otherwise known as Mormons or Mormonism. I've been wanting to respond to some of his comments for quite some time now. And finally today I have the chance. Now today is going to be a little bit different because it is actually my claim that in his recent interview with Piers Morgan on the infamous show Uncensored, Wesley Huff actually uses all the same arguments that can prove that the Book of Mormon is true and that Joseph Smith therefore truly was a prophet of God. Now I know that this is a bold claim, but as this video goes on today, you will see how the same arguments that Wesley uses to prove the Bible and defend the Bible from the point of view of maybe having a conversation with a skeptic or an atheist, the things that he discusses with Piers Morgan on his show, if you swap out some of the names and some of the terminology that he uses for them to be more appropriate for the LDS Church or in relation to the Book of Mormon and the golden plates, Wesley basically argues that the Book of Mormon is true, verifiable, and should be taken seriously. Now, before I get into his interview with Piers Morgan, a few months ago, Wesley Huff went on the Joe Rogan show. Now, this was probably Wesley Huff's biggest interview to date, and what really gave him a lot of recognition in the Christian world. Before this, he was known by many, of course, and was known to be a very intellectual scholar and historian when it comes to the Bible and Christianity, but his appearance on Joe Rogan definitely brought him to a new level of fame, so to speak. Now, with Wesley Huff being a Protestant and being very involved in discussions around Christianity, different denominations, different understandings of the Bible, so on and so forth, he of course has come across the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or as he would refer to it, the Mormons. Joe Rogan, likewise, especially having a huge love for Utah and all the hunting he does there, also is very familiar with the Mormon Church. Now, before I say what I'm about to say, let me preface with saying that I have a huge amount of respect for Joe Rogan. I think that he is a great podcaster, a great interviewer, and I think his influence on media and the way that we digest information has been completely beneficial. I have a huge amount of respect for how much he's grown as an individual and just the way that he's totally changed the way in which people consume media and come to understand things. Many people have a deep and profound respect for Joe, and they consider him to be one of the best interviewers in the world. Jordan Peterson famously gives him credit for being genuinely curious. Peterson often says that the reason why Joe Rogan is so popular and so successful is that he is genuinely curious, that he truly wants to know and understand things, especially things that he doesn't have any kind of expertise in or doesn't have a lot of understanding about. Now, I have to say, I believe that to be true. I believe that that is why Joe has so much success and why he's become such a great podcaster. But for some reason, through my many years of watching him and the many hours of podcasts that I've listened to, this seems to be true except for when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints comes into question. Whenever Mormonism is brought up around Joe Rogan, he seems to throw all reason and all intellect and all curiosity out the window. And he claims to know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Mormons are just a cult, that it's just a scam, and that we are 17 million people in the world who just believe this con artist by the name of Joseph Smith. Now, I have to say, this is something that I've been wanting to comment on for a while, and originally I was going to do a response video to the interview of Wesley Huff on the Joe Rogan show, and specifically dive into some of the claims that they make. And we will take a moment now to look at some of the conversation that they had because it leads into the latter part of this video with Wesley Huff and Piers Morgan. I didn't get around to doing it at the time. I was traveling to Utah to go see the wife's family and so on, so I just didn't get around to doing it. But, of course, Jacob Hansen at Thoughtful Faith made some responses and made some commentary about it, which I think is sufficient. So for anyone who wants to see a more in-depth conversation or even rebuttal about some of the things discussed between Joe and Wesley, I would encourage you to go check out the Jacob Hansen. I really loved what he said about Joe Rogan, and I think it's so fitting.
So Joe, From time to time, you do talk about Mormons publicly, but are you willing to do the work of talking to one of us publicly? Please know, Joe, that I am a big fan of yours, and I hope that you know that I'm not trying to be disrespectful. But there are millions of Latter-day Saints in America, and I don't think you have talked to even one of us, though from time to time you have talked about us. And I would happily let you ask me whatever you want about our faith if you had me on your program. Now, I'm also sure that there are still things that you will find crazy, but I think we could bring some clarity to points that people often misunderstand about Latter-day Saints.
Joe falls into this camp of people who talk about us but never talk to us. Now, Joe claims to know many Mormons.
So nice. I love them. I mean, Mormons that I've met have been so friendly. They're so family-oriented.
It's true.
It's like really easy to like think these are great people. I'll join them.
But in all the time that I've watched Joe Rogan, I don't think he has ever invited on a member of our church to discuss our theology, our doctrine, nor our history. Instead, Joe just believes whatever he hears on the internet.
The Mormon one is the craziest one.
Yeah,
because we know who wrote it.
Yeah.
And he's a shady dude.
He is a shady dude.
Well, he was, legitimate con man. Yeah, which is fascinating. Mormons are the nicest cult members.
Which I can attest as an active member of the church. 90% of what you hear about the LDS church on the internet is going to be negative, it's going to be twisted, and it's going to be usually anti and against what we actually believe and how we actually live our lives. Unfortunately, as intellectually intelligent as he seems to be, and although I have a profound respect for his understanding and studies of the Bible, Wesley Huff also seems to fall into this category. For someone so intelligent that is so willing to do research and spend time to really understand something, he seems, in my opinion, from some of the comments he makes, to have done very face-level research on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and what our doctrine is.
Book of Mormon trumps the Bible. So they would believe, I think it's the 10th article of the Mormon Church, is that they believe the Bible insofar as it is translated. I don't even know if the official LDS Church ascribes to the Joseph Smith translation. Talking about the Mormon Church, they recently did this thing where they're like, you don't need to go on the internet and you don't need to, and it's like, we know why they're family oriented, right?
Why?
Is because in what Joseph Smith wrote, there's an idea that everybody's soul pre-exists. And you were born as a spirit child in a previous life. And the reason you need to have children is you need to bring those people's souls into existence.
You get your own planet, which is pretty
dope. You get your own planet. Gotta encourage people to have kids because you're pulling those spirit babies out of the spiritual realm.
In the interview that Wesley and Joe did together a few months ago, they really seemed to just snigger and laugh about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and don't give us any due diligence or any fair amount of commentary, but instead just kind of push it aside as the nicest cult members that they know. So now, before we move on to Wesley Huff's recent interview with Piers Morgan on the Uncensored show, in closing, about Joe Rogan in particular, I would just echo Jacob Hansen's invitation. Joe, you are one of the most successful podcasters in the world. I don't think for a second that you're ever going to see what I am currently saying right now. But for anyone out there who has any kind of influence or any kind of connection to Joe Rogan, please just send him this message. Stop talking about the Mormon Church and telling people what we believe and what our history is, and instead have an active member, especially someone like potentially Jacob Hansen, who is an apologist for the church and is very involved in this space. Have someone on and ask them, what do we actually believe? And let us, for ourselves, set the record straight. Now, the reason why I started with this part about Wesley Huff being on Joe Rogan is because you can see from some of the comments that we've just watched, Wesley is very derogatory and somewhat condescending about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and really pushes it to the side, in the same category that he considers Islam, which he has openly talked about how he believes Islam to completely not be true and to be a false religion. So likewise, he pushes Mormonism to the side, and as we can see from his conversation with Joe Rogan, he kind of sniggers about it. Now, Wesley has made many claims throughout the years about his thoughts on Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, the gold plates, and further scripture that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints considers to be canon. However, as we now reflect on his interview with Piers Morgan and Piers pushing him and pressing him to do with the Bible and why we should believe in the Bible, we see that Wesley makes some arguments that I believe to be very hypocritical. Because although I agree with him, I totally agree with what he's saying and everything he says about the Bible and the importance of taking the Bible seriously and some of the things that he's going to get into with Piers Morgan that we're going to respond to now, as much as I agree with it, I also agree that the exact same arguments and the exact same point of view can be taken to show why the Book of Mormon and the gold plates from which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, why that should all be taken just as seriously. So, Piers Morgan and Wesley Huff start out this interview on the Uncensored show by Piers Morgan talking about his beliefs and how he is a Christian and considers himself to be a believer in Jesus Christ, especially being raised as a Catholic. In the first few minutes, the basic introduction to the conversation, especially from Wesley's point of view, is that Jesus Christ was indeed a real person. Whether you are Christian or of any other sect of religion, or whether you are an atheist or just completely a secular individual, historians at large from all sides of the argument all agree that a man named Jesus Christ from Nazareth, who was a teacher and considered a rabbi amongst the Jewish tradition, truly did live, and he truly was executed by means of the crucifixion by the Roman Empire. They then go on to say that they believe that not only did this man exist, but that he indeed was resurrected. And this is when Piers Morgan starts to play a little bit of devil's advocate and starts to push Wesley to give some answers and some greater understanding to why this belief is plausible.
From the text of the New Testament then, where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that that actually happened?
Yeah, I think we do, Piers, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame. If we want to know about someone from the ancient world or history in general, we go to the earliest sources, preferably eyewitness sources. And I think that's what we have within the Gospels.
So, as we can see here, Wesley Huff goes straight to the argument of eyewitnesses. Now, this is a very interesting approach, one that I agree with. I agree that for me, the New Testament Gospels help us to have a better understanding that Jesus Christ truly was the Son of God and was the Redeemer and Messiah of the world, and that he was resurrected on the third day. I believe these accounts, and I believe the testimonies and witnesses found therein, and I believe the implications of this text. So I agree with what Wesley is saying. So when he's pushed by Piers Morgan, who's playing a little bit of devil advocate, he basically goes straight to eyewitnesses. That one of the reasons why we can believe that Jesus Christ not only was a real figure in the history of the world, but indeed was resurrected, is because of the eyewitness accounts of his resurrection. Now, I know that Wesley is very familiar with the Book of Mormon. He is familiar with some of its teachings, but I know from commentary that he's made and different interviews that he's been in, that he's aware that one of the claims that we have in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon is because of the witnesses to the gold plates from which Joseph Smith translated this sacred record. There are approximately 19 witnesses to the gold plates, but officially there are 11. 3 of the witnesses, 3 out of the 11, claim to not only have handled the golden plates and felt of the physical reality of these plates, they also claim to have had a heavenly experience where a heavenly messenger visited them and handed them the plates himself. They also claim that they heard the voice of God testifying of the truthfulness of these things. Now, I'm currently working on a video, a comprehensive defense of the Book of Mormon, in which I dive a little bit deeper into the story of these witnesses and why this is such a profound defense for the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. There are other LDS apologists in this space who have done extreme amount of work and commentary on this, so I'd invite you to check out some of my fellow LDS apologists, such as Stephen Murphy, who has the channel Mormonism with the Murph, Jacob Hansen, of course, who we talked about earlier at Thoughtful Faith, and others like Greg Madsen from Quick Media, and of course our crazy friends over at Ward Radio. And this is just to name a few. But the idea of the testimony of these eyewitnesses being so integral to the Book of Mormon is something that we often talk about in the church. And we can see here that Wesley is making the same argument for the Bible. One of the reasons why he believes in the truthfulness of the resurrected Lord is because of the eyewitness accounts found in the Gospels in the New Testament. But yet will not take seriously the gold plates from which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, even though we have more testimony and more eyewitnesses than there is for even the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, this is not to belittle the importance of the glorious message of Christ's resurrection. It is the pinnacle of our church. His atoning sacrifice is at the center of our doctrine and our theology as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But when we consider that there are only maybe 2 or 3 actual written witnesses in the New Testament, regardless of the claim of how many actually saw the risen Lord, we actually only have 2 or 3 that actually wrote it down themselves. We have over 11 official witnesses for the Book of Mormon. And apart from the 3 special witnesses who had the heavenly experience and were visited by a heavenly messenger and heard the voice of God testifying of the truthfulness of these things, we also have the 8 witnesses who were handed the gold plates by Joseph Smith himself and were able to handle the golden plates, run their fingers through the leaves thereof, and added their witness to the reality of these golden plates which Joseph Smith claimed to have translated the Book of Mormon from. So we have 11 official witnesses that claim they saw the gold plates from which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. They witness and testify that these plates were not only real, but that they did indeed have on them ancient character which were exactly what Joseph Smith translated from. Oftentimes a criticism for the witnesses is that many people claim that the witnesses did not handle or see the plates for themselves, but that they simply believed stories that they had heard or things that Joseph Smith himself had been telling them. Now, this is completely untrue. As discussed earlier, and as one can read for themselves in the introduction pages of the Book of Mormon, all of these witnesses testified that they handled and felt the golden plates for themselves, independent of anyone else, and that they testify of their reality.
And the accounts of that are not just kind of scant. They're not seeing Jesus off from afar as some sort of apparition or something like that. What we have is the case of instances of the early Jesus community saying they walked with him, they talked with him, they ate with him.
Just as Wesley Huff argues here, the accounts of Jesus Christ's resurrection are not scant accounts where people claim to have seen something from afar. The accounts of the eyewitnesses for the plates are not what the critics and antis to the church say, that they simply were just second-hand, but that they themselves held the plates and touched them, just as the witnesses in the New Testament felt the nail marks in the Saviour's hands and in his feet and the spear wound in his side, and they testified that in reality this was Jesus, he who was crucified for the sins of the world, that he truly had been resurrected, that they didn't just see a spiritual experience or see him from afar and think it was him, but they knew of a surety that it was indeed him. Likewise, the witnesses for the gold plates which the Book of Mormon was translated from had a surety that these plates existed. So we can see here point number 1. Wesley Huff is arguing a little bit like a hypocrite when you consider that he believes the Bible to be a reliable source of truth in relation to Jesus Christ and his resurrection, but dismisses the Book of Mormon as simply the work of a con man.
There's only one other reference to the fact that 500 people witnessed this. Does any of that, in your eyes, put more doubt on it?
So Piers Morgan will now push back a little bit on Wesley's approach to the eyewitnesses, saying that really there's not a lot of eyewitnesses, that even some of the people that the New Testament claim to have been eyewitnesses, there's no writing from them. And so what do you do when there's people pushing back and saying, well, really the eyewitnesses can kind of be put to the side because apart from them, there's not a whole lot of evidence for this. As we'll see now, Wesley Huff will go on to argue about how you need to explain the additional data surrounding Jesus Christ and his resurrection. Likewise, a similar argument has been made by even people like Wesley Huff or other critics of the church. Well, these people might have seen the gold plates, but very few of them saw Joseph Smith actually translate for them. How can you explain that there's questions and doubts about the translation process? Even within the LDS Church, there's some people who think Joseph Smith translated one way and some people who think he translated another. So how do you account for this? Now, Wesley Huff is going to approach this from the perspective of needing to explain for the additional data surrounding these accounts. And likewise, the same argument can be made about the Book of Mormon. Even if people didn't see the translation process, even if you put aside the witnesses of the testimony, one has to consider the data concerning the Book of Mormon and the influence it has had on the world.
I don't think so, because I think when we look at something that we can try to historiographically explain, we look at the various explanations and then we account for the data. Others in the New Testament documents that talk about the resurrection of Jesus, that, even James, the brother of Jesus, in the Epistle of James, referring to his brother as our glorious Lord, a title that is attributed only to the God of Israel, Yahweh.
So, we see in this segment that Wesley Huff basically pushes back, and the basic idea of his argument is that on top of the eyewitnesses, we also need to account for additional data. Now, what I would say in this regard, where this for me is a double standard regarding how Wesley Huff views the LDS Church, is that it's one thing if you want to push back against the eyewitnesses to the golden plates and the Book of Mormon. But what you can't account for is the data found on how many people, since Joseph Smith translated that ancient record, have had a spiritual experience and received their own witness of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. So the idea here, some might argue that this is an appeal to consequence, but ultimately I agree with Wesley Huff that this is indeed something that you still have to take seriously. Although an appeal to consequence doesn't prove something is true, you still have to take it into account when looking at the broader picture. And this is something that Wesley Huff is going to get into a little bit more later, about some of the sacrifices that these eyewitnesses to the resurrection were willing to make because of the truthfulness of what they believed. But ultimately, when you look at the effect the Book of Mormon has had on the world, it is data that you have to take into account and that you can't simply dismiss. Just like the data found regarding the New Testament and even books outside of the New Testament, like James, the brother of Jesus, in the Epistle of James, referring to his brother as the glorious Lord. This is data that you can't ignore. Likewise, the consequences of the Book of Mormon and its influence on people's testimonies and faith in Jesus Christ is not something that you can simply ignore. Now at this point, having discussed eyewitnesses and the additional data surrounding these topics, the next point that Piers Morgan is going to play devil's advocate on is about how eyewitness testimony in today's world isn't considered credible or isn't considered sufficient to be completely convincing. And so Wesley Huff is going to grapple with this idea that even if you claim to have eyewitnesses, maybe the eyewitness accounts just simply aren't enough.
Now, again, to play devil's advocate, the argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate people. Eyewitness testimony notoriously is unreliable. It's the least credible evidence in a courtroom these days, for example. And since the historical method doesn't deal with miracles, it's ridiculous, people say, to base any history on it. And even Matthew's gospel tells us when Jesus appeared in front of his 11 disciples, some of them doubted, to which people say, well, if even not all his disciples believe this, why on earth should we?
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on there. In terms of the historical method and how we actually evaluate things, we only have witness testimony. You do have something that's very different than a courtroom in a modern legal setting, right? Even something like hearsay. Well, all of ancient history in one sense is hearsay, but that doesn't apply when we apply it to the historiographical method. Now, I would say, to the accusation, well, these are just ancient, illiterate people. That's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. Just because people are ancient neither means they're stupid nor that they don't know what's going on.
Okay, so Wesley Huff just touched on something very important here. Chronological snobbery. This is exactly the kind of criticism and the kind of pushback that many people use to criticize the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, both in their day and even now. People push back and say that these people were naive, gullible, that they were illiterate or unintelligent, that they had been deceived by this con man named Joseph Smith, who was just a farm boy trying to get rich and gain power. In my opinion, Wesley Huff hits it on the nail. This is chronological snobbery, in the words of C.S. Lewis. Just because these people lived in the 1800s, just because they were farmers or had less of the technology that we had today, does not mean that they were naive, does not mean that they were easily duped, does not mean that they were unintelligent. And thus, this is a straw man argument to use against the witnesses of Christ's resurrection, and furthermore, against the witnesses of the Book of Mormon and the golden plates. Last but certainly not least, the final approach that Wesley Huff is going to take is talking about what the apostles were willing to go through because of their testimonies.
I think we have to look at, okay, what explains these 11 scared disciples then going on to not just proclaim that Jesus did rise from the dead, but actually went to the point of risking their lives in persecution. And some of them did die for that proclamation. And so I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility for history to actually be able to evaluate this evidence. And you know, Stephen is the first martyr. That also happens in Jerusalem. That would have been a warning shot across the bow for the disciples if they wanted to continue on proclaiming these things. They would have realized that this is controversial, both in Jewish circles and in Gentile circles, to be proclaiming these things, to be declaring Jesus as Lord. You know, one of the earliest confessions of Christianity was Jesus is Lord, when the society was saying Caesar is Lord. And so there were risks politically, there were risks religiously, and yet the disciples go on to proclaim these things, even to the detriment of their own lives.
Wesley, I couldn't agree with you more. And I totally am in awe of the apostles and their bravery and courage to stand true to their testimonies of Jesus Christ, the risen Lord. But do you know who else went to the death because of his testimony? Joseph Smith. Do you know who else went to the death because of his testimony? Hyrum Smith, his brother. Do you know that the early Mormons, the early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, were driven from every place that they tried to settle, every town that they tried to gather in? They were driven all the way until they had to go all the way out west and settle on their own for themselves in Utah, facing a ferocious winter on the pioneer trek out west. Many of them dying in the process. Have you heard of Hans Mill Massacre, where Mormon children and Mormon men were massacred simply because they were members of the church? For me, if one wants to argue that the fruits of their testimonies and what they were willing to sacrifice to stand true to their testimony, if one is willing to argue this as a part of the proof for why we should believe the apostles' witness of Christ the risen Lord, the exact same can be said as why we should believe in the testimonies of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith restoring Christ's church to the earth. Joseph Smith and his brother went to the grave for their testimonies and their witness that Jesus Christ was restoring his true and full church to the earth again today through the prophet Joseph Smith. There were many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the early days that were beaten, that were tarred and feathered, and that were even killed because of their membership in the Mormon Church and their witness of the truthfulness of the doctrine and the Book of Mormon. So Wesley, I couldn't agree with you more. When someone is willing to die, when someone is willing to leave everything that they know for something that they know to be true and that they cannot deny, that in and of itself is something that we should take very seriously, and in most rational people's minds should be sufficient proof to say, there might be something here, there might be something true, that these people were willing to sacrifice this much for what they claimed to know. So I hope you all enjoyed this video today. It's a little bit of a different one on my channel, but when I saw this interview on Piers Morgan Uncensored, I couldn't help but think, wow, every point that he's making could be used to defend the Book of Mormon and the eyewitnesses to the gold plates from which it was translated. I add my testimony and my witness that the Book of Mormon is indeed the Word of God. It is indeed another testament of Jesus Christ. It helps us to better know and understand his gospel and his teachings, and it testifies that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Redeemer, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that he was indeed resurrected and that he will come again to this earth. I know that the Book of Mormon is true, and I know that Joseph Smith was truly called of God. He truly did see what he said he saw, and he truly did translate the Book of Mormon from an ancient historical record. If you found this video to be interesting, or if it maybe helped you grow and strengthen your testimony of the Book of Mormon and the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and of the prophet Joseph Smith, please feel free to share this video with others who might also find it interesting. Comment below your thoughts and any feedback you have. If you haven't yet already, please subscribe to the channel. And last but certainly not least, until next time,